Brett,
Yeah.
maybe just maybe introduce yourself very briefly, like who you are, what you've been working on, and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm Brett Scott, and originally actually kind of come from an anthropology background, but I also worked in the financial sector in exotic derivatives, but also combining a bunch of left-wing politics with that. So originally I was kind of known as a kind of like left-wing finance guy. Um, but then I kind of pivoted quite a lot into looking the sort of anthropology of money and also the intersection of big tech and big finance. And my last book, Cloudmoney, was all about the sort of structural change that's been going on in the global economy between the sort of fusion of big tech and big finance, and how that manifests in the public realm as an attack on the physical cash system. And so people also know me as this kind of like pro-cash guy sometimes. But a lot of my work has also been involved with like analyzing the sort of background ideology of crypto over the years as well, how that relates to people's perceptions of money. Yeah, bits and pieces. And people in so the Substack's actually great because it sort of allows for a lot deeper explorations of these types of issues in a way that normal newspapers historically didn't really allow. So a lot of my Substack work is quite sort of experimental, trying to build metaphors, imagery, like literal imagery sometimes of how to understand monetary systems and economic systems. Yeah, that's my basic vibe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Substack is super wonderful in many ways right now as a medium. Yeah, because you can basically, there's so many constraints if you write for magazines or
Yeah,
newspapers,
exactly.
and here you can actually go in many different directions, explore your whole. But I saw you just had one about Andrew Tate and insecurity in South Africa. You
Oh,
wrote
yeah,
about
yeah.
that
Well,
on
that was
your
one of the notes.
notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what were you thinking about there?
Yeah, well, I'm from South Africa, and I actually grew up at the tail end of apartheid, which was, for anybody who doesn't know about apartheid, a systematized, legalized version of like institutional racism, essentially, a bunch of laws. Um, and this is the reason why South Africa is often likened to Israel nowadays, because there's lots of similarities in the way that the structures worked. But I grew up at the tail end of apartheid. At that time when it really felt like a fascist police state. And so I kind of have quite a lot of experience of that sort of violent, macho kind of culture. And yeah, when I see people like Andrew Tate, I guess in the note I was saying that that type of like alpha male posturing type of stuff, which is quite a big part of, I guess in a way, like certain forms of libertarian individualism. A lot of it comes from fear or insecurity. So it's a type of defense strategy used by people when they're perceived in situations of threat. This is like a big part of the core part of like sort of white South African identity, actually. Um, it also helps you to understand things like the Israeli mentality. So, for example, in the early parts of when colonial South Africa was forming, the Afrikaans settlers were basically poor peasants who sat on the front lines. Well, not peasants, but they were like sort of itinerant farmers, and they basically developed this whole kind of mentality, which is like, if we don't crush the native, black population, we will be destroyed and engulfed, right? Which is actually very, very similar to what you'll find in the kind of Zionist mentality. Um, and so they developed this incredibly racist way of seeing the world, but it's incredibly defensive at the same time. And then at some point during apartheid, they systematized that into like a whole police state, right? It's like this incredibly repressive state apparatus. So this whole kind of like macho posturing culture in South Africa really came from that kind of essentially deep, deep insecurity. And so I have a sort of weird position where I actually kind of hate that kind of culture, but I also sort of come from that setting, and it sort of sometimes helps me to understand some of those dynamics.
Yeah, but Andrew Tate's not South African, is he? No.
No, no, but that kind of vibe, right?
Yeah,
Which is
but I
all
mean,
about
but
like
I mean,
exuding
specific. Yeah,
control.
yeah, but specifically, like white South Africans are having a huge influence right now in the U.S. Obviously,
Yeah,
because we
yeah,
have,
exactly.
Elon Musk, who father I think ran a emerald mine and made a fortune. and Peter Thiel, whose father was apparently an engineer in charge of a uranium mine, which was apparently incredibly brutal in terms of the sickness and the punishment to the black miners.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe that helps
David
explain a
Sachs as
little bit.
well.
What's that? David
David
Sachs,
Sachs.
exactly. So I haven't explored David Sachs as deeply as the other two yet. Um, but yeah, maybe some of what you're, I mean, it's sort of interesting that these guys, first of all, either, accidentally, maybe they had some kind of insight that allowed them to make money in the system to such a huge degree. But then also that ideology, which now seems to have like really surfaced, it seems to be
Yeah.
what's partially driving the situation.
It's an interesting one. It's like, because I don't know, it's obviously more complex than what I'm making out. But for example, my dad is part of the special forces when I was growing up, in Southern Africa. You're part of the special forces in Southern Africa. It's like dirty business, right? They were, it was hardcore stuff that they were. But my dad, when I was growing up in that context, he never romanticized any of that kind of stuff. Whereas lots of the sort of Andrew Tate type figures do, partly because they kind of like, it's a sort of a posturing sort of situation where they're sort of emulating some imagined ideal of, like, I don't know, some sort of like overblown masculinity, which is something you actually often only find with people who aren't really involved in conflicts, right? So Elon Musk maybe had some of this too, right? Because at some point he was probably like a kind of victimized type of geek character in apartheid South Africa, right? So he's got a weird thing where he sort of like ran away from South Africa and joined sort of geek culture, but now he's almost like revisiting this weird like far right racist side of himself. I don't fully know what's going on, but there's definitely a South African connection to how he's behaving.
Yeah,
Maybe I should explore it sometime.
yeah. Um, yeah, what is it that, maybe growing up from that context, like Thiel and Musk did, is there something in that, despite, besides just like racism and maybe insecurity and, kind of yeah, maybe a strong survival instinct, that led them to kind of like prosper, so intensively in the American system. You know?
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting thing. Like white South Africans during the 90s and I guess early 2000s, there was a lot of like fleeing the country because of they used to basically be in control of the
Yeah,
country. And then when the black government came in, they were like, oh, we're going to be persecuted, so we better escape. And so it was a big kind of exodus of white South Africans to the US, to the UK, to Australia. And so, I don't know anybody. I was based in London for a while, and sort of from like 2008 and so. And lots of the old South Africans there were these kind of people who had sort of escaped in a sense. Well, imagine that they were escaping. Okay, and so they kind of got into all these positions around in sort of in the London scene. And actually, historically, they were quite valued as workers in that world because they were quite ruthless in a way.
mm,
They would tend to have fewer of the assumptions that British workers would have. British workers kind of expected a degree of protection and so on, whereas the South Africans would come in and just be like a bit just prepared to do anything in a sense. So they developed this kind of like mercenary type of vibe to them. And I suspect that the kind of like PayPal mafia crew have that same vibe to them. They're just like, we come in, we have our little solidarity networks, we take over in the sort of these businesses. And yeah, I don't know. I'll give you a very crude version of this, but there's definitely this kind of like almost a settler mentality that you find in white South Africans.
yeah. I
Does
was
that
just trying
resonate?
to.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm right now. I've been forcing myself to watch Elon Musk's interview with Joe Rogan, and
Yeah, I saw that 3 hours. Jeez.
yeah, I mean, just to sort of, I mean, now this person is exerting so much power over American society, and it's sort of
Mm.
hard to figure out where he's actually consciously lying, or where he himself has gotten sort of enmeshed in this kind of like alternative reality, where he keeps talking about, the liberals, and the Democrats, and everybody else being meshed in
Super
this
hard to
alternative
know.
reality. What's that?
Super hard to know. Yeah. I feel like it would
Yeah,
take weeks and weeks and weeks of research to kind of really figure it out.
yeah, yeah. But one thing that's really, yeah, the contempt that he has for government, for public service, the sense that everybody who's involved with that is like, a scammer or corrupt, that he has this like purity and, he's the one who's going to come in. I mean, there's definitely some sense where he believes himself to be on some kind of mission. And I mean, Rogan is incredible because he's just an incredible like patsy. Like, I mean, it's like propaganda. Like he doesn't push back against anything that
Yeah,
Musk has
exactly.
to say. It's kind of extraordinary.
Fawning.
Fawning, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so I mean, Musk said that he's not responsible for firing air traffic controllers or U.S. aid workers who are trying to feed starving kids or just distribute AIDS drugs. And then if you do the test, a search for the articles, then you find, every mainstream article agrees that this is all happening and he's responsible. So yeah, it's like it's very scary. I mean, I know a lot of people. I was just talking to a friend who lives in Austin, and he was talking about a lot of his friends who are, doctors, people like Mark Hyman, like intelligent, people that were really considered like thoughtful, important, members of society have shifted over to this worldview right now, kind of through
Yeah,
this like RFK, Elon Musk pipeline.
yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know how we recover from this, or how this it's like watching like a fever, like a fire take off or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, actually, in my last, I've just put out this piece today, actually, just like about an hour ago, which is called The Archipelago. And there's one angle in that, it's about Bitcoin. It's about the ideology behind Bitcoin. But there's certain things in there that, I'm interested to explore further, which might, explain some more elements of the picture, because, well, how do I say this in a non-complicated way? In a sense, there's like an ideal type version of capitalism that's imagined in the libertarian imagination, right? Then there's actual capitalism, which is different. And there's always been this weird interaction between those two things, right? You kind of like, if you're a libertarian type person, you sort of either have to reject what you see around, you're like, well, we don't have true capitalism, or you have to kind of shoehorn it into the ideal model. And in a weird way, I feel like a lot of the sort of centrist liberal type politicians for a long time just skirted that kind of thing over, right? They would sort of speak about the system in a certain way, and the kind of sort of euphoria moment, in a sense, is people kind of, there's a sort of purity of the vision being pushed out by Trump and Musk and stuff, the sort of ideal type imagination of like bottom-up capitalism. And I'm attaching this to the sort of euphoria around Bitcoin, because historically, this is what the Bitcoin community has always done, right? They've sort of generate this like ideal of what money is, quote unquote, supposed to be, right? And they create this whole sense of a grand conspiracy, in which money right now isn't actually real, and as long as you can, when you can finally see that, you can join this kind of enlightened masses who will kind of work towards this new Platonic ideal of money. Anyway, this article is kind of going into the sort of like thought structure. I could go into that more if you
Yeah,
want, but
you can go into sure, go ahead.
yeah. So basically, what I've been interested in for quite a long time, because I've been involved in the Bitcoin community since 2011, basically, right? So I've had a long exposure to the community, and how the thought works. But I also come from economic anthropology background, a kind of more sort of David Graeber style of thinking around money,
Yeah,
right?
you said Graeber is one of your big influences. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
And David Graeber historically would kind of represent more of a sort of like left-wing anarchist / economic anthropology way of seeing the world. The starting point of a Graeber-esque type of approach, but not only Graeber, I would say just like economic anthropology more generally, is that your sort of starting image of an economy is that people are enmeshed like that, right? Like you can't, like that's where you start. In
Yeah.
the libertarian worldview, though, you don't start like that. like when you start thinking about an economy as a libertarian, you always imagine these like separated individuals,
Right.
right?
Like that
And
book,
that starting
the book
point,
that book, The Sovereign Individual, which is like one of
yeah,
big
that
textbooks.
starting point has a massive influence on how you then think about money, right? And so basically in the article, I'm looking at how that starting point creates certain imaginations of what money is supposed to be in your head. You can also debate how you get to that starting point. So one of my big arguments about the Bitcoin community, the dark secret about the Bitcoin community, there's many dark secrets, but one of them is that the type of mentality you need to start to believe in the basic background story of Bitcoin is created by large-scale nation states. Okay, and this is like an economic anthropology point. It'll come from people like Karl Polanyi, right? Who basically will say something like, large-scale capitalist markets don't exist without states, right? They form the underlying foundation of like making markets big. If you want to have like really large-scale markets, you need these big nation-state players. Okay, now once you create that, and they'll have to use their own monetary systems to do that, to create that scale. And the type of monetary system that they'll use will not be a commodity system, it'll be a fiat system, right? But once you have people in that structure, once you're like a tiny little individual in a huge nation state system, you can start to generate an ideology of individualism, right? You can start to like fantasize about yourself as being an individual. And that is where the sort of fascination with commodity money starts to emerge. So ironically, it's a large scale fiat money system will generate the mythology of commodity money internal to itself. Right? This takes a little while to kind of, in a sense, get your head around. But if you look at modern economics, for example, the context of modern economics forms is in super large scale European cities, right? Which are already created by large scale nation state monetary system structures and legal structures. Now, if you're that person in that context, the way you experience the world is you see like these gigantic seas of strangers who seem to be engaging in this kind of detached form of exchange. And that's the sort of the starting point of modern economics. Their sort of starting image of these random adults who walk into markets and exchange comes from that very particular historically specific context, and then they generate their worldview from that perspective. So lots of the sort of like fantasies around Bitcoin come from this like nation state starting point. Does that kind of make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, that makes some sense.
Yeah.
But of course, actually, as my friend Guy said in the comments, this is why it's so insane they're destroying the state, because they will realize they totally depended on the state all along.
Yeah,
Do
this has
you?
been a critique of libertarianism for a very long time, right? But the interesting thing about libertarianism is that it's actually the kind of native cosmology of capitalism. It's the thing you would most likely expect people to believe if they found themselves in a capitalist system. If you like
Mm,
plonked somebody into a capitalist system at a large scale, the type of worldview they're most likely to come up with is I'm a detached individual alone in a society and I have to fend for myself. I have to do self-help, right? Which is basically the libertarian worldview.
yeah.
Like the actual political philosophy of libertarianism will then go and formalize that, and the discipline of economics will kind of try to make a sort of science out of it. But it is also like very normal in society for people to have these types of beliefs, right? It's like the most typical thing. And actually, this is what, with Marxists, when they're trying to form, class consciousness, like what's the whole point of that? It's like you have to go to a bunch of people who basically have a libertarian worldview, who see themselves as alone, and you've got to convince them that actually they're not alone. Actually, they're part of a group that has some common interest, right?
Yeah.
And that was not, taken for granted.
I found this very interesting, kind of like weird Middle Eastern commentator, Islamic guy, who's sort of controversial, but I wrote about one of his long videos. And yeah, so he basically said that what's being done to the US now is, pretty similar to what, we've done to other countries around the world over time. So for instance, after the USSR collapsed, Milton Friedman style economists went in there. They were like, okay, you have to privatize everything and sell it off to the highest bidder, which allowed for,
Yeah.
the capitalist class to make a quick fortune, but unfortunately also led to kleptocracy, and ultimately Putin emerged out of that. So essentially, what seems to be the idea, although it is like just so astonishing that they actually seem to be doing this, is to basically like crash the U.S., like force some
Yeah.
kind of economic meltdown, and then those who have a huge amount of wealth, while they may lose a certain proportion of their wealth, as everybody else does, also, they'll still have so much more wealth. They'll be able to buy the distressed assets, whether it's like real estate or public parks or companies, for like pennies on the dollar, and sort of complete the sort of privatization process of resources, and centralize that power in fewer and fewer hands, which will also be aided and abetted by artificial intelligence and blockchain technologies and so on.
Mm.
Yeah, does that accord to how you think things are happening, or why they're happening in this way?
I think there's so many different levels going on. I mean, yeah, and I agree with you there. But I think what it's confusing to me is, right, and maybe this is because I've been focusing on, again, if I spend a few weeks like sitting and observing all the actions of the administration, like you have, maybe I would come to a clearer picture. Um, but what I'm always fascinated with like ideology is like to what extent the people who are going through those processes like believe in it themselves.
Yeah,
Like, so you're saying with Elon, it's like a lot of the actions when you observe them are clearly like kleptocratic, sort of plutocratic actions, right? If
yeah,
you if you're viewing the world through like a self-interest lens, you're like, well, these people are clearly enriching themselves. Like Trump, when he's building the crypto strategic reserve, for example, is clearly handing out patronage to the crypto industry. Like he's just going to use the central bank to buy up Bitcoin to boost its price,
yeah,
right? It sort of looks like very much like a clear case of just like kleptocracy. But then like there's an actual like deep worldview going on where I think like if you're sitting in the position of this person, of these types of people in the administration, you might actually be believing like a particular thing, like you're believing that you're doing God's work at some level, right? Um, and
I think
yeah,
that
I'm going with it. This is what I'm
yeah,
fascinated with.
I think what we've learned is that the human mind has a very great propensity
Yeah,
to believe things, and to convince itself, that it's doing. I mean, I have a little bit of a personal analogy. Like, I always like tried to like fight for the good, or when I saw was correct. But then I had like my own shadows around like sexuality when I became famous and so on. And, I acted in some ways really poorly for a while. But in my mind, I was like, this is all about sexual liberation. And, if we can create this huge liberational current in humanity, that'll be the thing that saves the world,
yeah, yeah,
so I think it's exactly like that, and as a man, I think also it's easy to kind of get a little dissociated, and also if you're in a position of fame or influence, you have that ends up to support your own kind of perspective, your own delusions in a sense.
yeah,
So I think that's kind of what's happened. I think that Musk, believe. I mean, they've cobbled together an ideology. Some of it works together and some of it doesn't. Some of it is a little bit contradictory, but what one piece is, yeah, that the nation state is over. That's like the sovereign individual is basically we're moving into network states, or what Yarvin calls patchwork states. So democracy is also over according to Yarvin. It didn't work. It wasn't able to, and I mean, I suppose like in a way. What's happened to the U.S. now is in a way the biggest kind of ironically example of how democracy may not work anymore, because Putin, who's actually a much smaller actor than the U.S. with much less resources, because he's been in power for so long and had the capacity to innovate and try different strategies and figure out how to manipulate consciousness and media. He's basically won a war against the U.S. without having to, get involved with shooting at us,
Yeah.
and that was only because he was entrenched in that position for so long, and had the, and meanwhile with our government, every 4 to 8 years, everything turns around again. So, there is a sense, I think, in a way, that this form of, you know,
Yeah.
parliamentary republic democracy kind of a thing is not working very well at a time when technology is moving so quickly, and the environment is changing so fast, and people are so reactive and responsive. I mean, I'm still hopeful that there will be kind of like a new, more participatory and cooperative kind of more like authentic or direct democracy that can sort of outcompete this. But at the moment, this movement towards authoritarianism, or even autocracy, feels like a
Yeah.
very, very
That kind of
powerful
a
thing.
kind of autarky thing. Like, well, one of the things I'm kind of interested with right now in terms of like the underlying ideologies, or the kind of seeming inconsistencies between them, um, is, I guess in my last piece I was calling it fractal libertarianism. So again, I'm kind of unsure about this still, but if you look at the sort of the underlying image in a libertarian worldview, which is a native cosmology in capitalism anyway, right, is of the sort of solo islands, right? Like each man an island. This is the vision that Margaret Thatcher put out, right? Which was, there is no society, there are only individual men and women,
Yeah,
right? So this is the underlying kind of like classical sort of liberal concept of the social contract. Basically, it's like you have a bunch of solo individuals, and they recognize through their solo rationality that they can come closer together into proximity to form social relations, but it has to be in their interest to do so, right? So this is how social contract theorists, I don't know, like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke and stuff, use this to sort of attack monarchs and stuff, to say, all the individuals who come together to form the body of the state should have individual rights, because they could choose to dissolve society if they wanted to, right? And that's the sort of starting point. This is how economists imagine markets. They imagine these solo individuals who choose to come and form markets, and so on. But actually, if you take that same vision and you abstract it upwards, you get to basically nationalism, right? Which is like each country is a solo sovereign island, and the international order is an illusion. And if the international order isn't working for you, screw it, you can leave and dissolve society, essentially.
yeah,
Right? And it's kind of interesting with the Trump world. Like it seems like these fractal layers work a lot, because he often will generate that like underlying image of a sort of bottom-up capitalism, which is a sort of, like the sort of every man for himself kind of, the sort of ideal vision of what capitalism is supposed to be. But then he'll also, and he'll talk about that in terms of winners and losers, right? So it's like, I'm a winner, get off your ass, and you can also be a winner as well. And then he talks about it at the levels of companies. So like, Musk is revered because he has a winner type of companies. And then at the level of nations. So it's like America first, China second, etc. Right? So there's some weird like fractal libertarian thing happening as
yeah,
well, like going on, I think. Because normally you would imagine something like nationalism doesn't really work with a libertarian message, right? That kind of jingoistic patriotism has essentially a collectivist vibe to it, right? It's like a bunch of people all like cheering for a team. But actually with that kind of thought structure where you sort of, I don't know, you're imagining your nation as this sort of like solo individual fighting other nations. It actually kind of weirdly like resonates with libertarianism.
totally. I mean, I guess one thing that people, who want to see this project fail are kind of hoping for at this point, I don't know if it's legitimately going to happen, is the fissures and cracks in the sort of right-wing alliance, could potentially widen. So we
Sure.
saw that with
Almost certainly.
the fight over the H-1B visas, basically becoming clear that Musk and the tech Andreessen and so on, they have really they're not make America first, make America great, or America first people at all. They just want to create the
Yeah.
best. They're transnational. super wealthy, who probably have multiple passports and multiple places to escape to if anything goes
Yeah.
wrong and so on. And yes, that's one fissure. And then the other fissure would be between the sort of more like moral Christian evangelicals who have a very rigid construct of morality,
Yeah.
and a lot of the people on the tech side who are a little bit more libertine, as Musk is, obviously. Um, I don't know though. I'm not that convinced that these contradictions are going to be what breaks down their fast running boat to
Well,
apocalypse
there's
or
a couple.
whatever.
I mean, there's a couple of things that could break it down. I mean, one, it could be the contradictions in the like, like I mean, Steve Bannon already hates the tech oligarchs, so that there's already that kind of dissent, and um, well about that. Then there's like the hitting up against reality of capitalism. That could also be the other thing. It's like wave your fist at China, and it's like, okay, it's like in an interconnected global economy, China is like incredibly powerful. It's like,
Yeah,
so there's a lot of sort of posturing about the imagined ability to have this sort of breakaway moment, but the reality of the economic system is different, right?
yeah.
And so, uh,
I mean, I
and
guess
then the metaphor you could use about that is always a metaphor I always enjoy for like interdependent economic systems is to think about bodies. It could be like, I mean, I was using this metaphor for my last piece, like you could be like, if the liver says, screw you, we're leaving, it's like, okay, fine, you can do that, right? But it's like you're gonna dissolve into nothingness, like,
Yeah,
uh, you know. So in a sense, to recreate that kind of thing after so many years of globalization, which basically is an integration process where you're creating that interdependence at a transnational scale, you have to reverse so many things to get out of that situation.
yeah,
Right? You have to basically pull apart a whole body and rebuild it. And that process is politically dangerous because it can have so many backfiring things that go on in that process. That took a long, long time to build that interdependence at a transnational scale. So you can't just put it apart overnight.
yeah,
So
totally. Mhm.
I think that's a big potential political risk for people like Trump. They bluster about their ability to just like have some kind of like have their hands on the controls of the global economy. It's like global capitalism don't give a shit about your aspirations or your personal ego like that. It's like it's much bigger than they are.
I mean, Trump's whole business career is like an extraordinary litany of like bankruptcies and failures. And I was just watching a little cartoony video last night, which pointed out that essentially after he, crashed and burned, he went to Russia, I think in like 1987, and they basically made him the mule, where he would help the Russian mafia kind of like launder their fortune. So they built Trump Tower, and apparently that's like the only co-op in New York where you can buy apartments anonymously. So it was just ways for them to move money through his operations, and that's also why he's so totally beholden to Putin and
Yeah,
to Russia. Um,
I get that
but I
sense.
mean, what's that?
I get that sense too.
But that also is, yeah, it suggests that. I haven't. Do you understand even from their side of the street, like what the logic of the tariffs is? Is it just to kind of force, as you say, the sort of deglobalization? I mean, it just seems like 25% on products from China. I mean, that's going to be, or as I said, is it really, the idea is really just to torment the American populace and, kind of, because, Musk also floated before the election. He was like, yeah, we're going to cause some pain to the American, consumer for a while, but it's all going to be for the best. And we're going to be like, America will be great again after this pain period.
Yeah.
Do they think that people will accept that? You maybe don't know, you're European or whatever. You may not be thinking about it as much as I am.
No, of course, it affects everywhere right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's intriguing. I don't really know. I mean, my former professor is called Hajung Chang. He's quite a well-known guy. and he's well known in the UK at least. So I studied with Ha-Joon, and Ha-Joon's dad was one of the guys who was behind the South Korean miracle. With the so-called South Korean miracle. Basically, South Korea was a very poor country, and then they basically went hard in on like protectionism or sort of like strategic protection of industries. They basically realized it's like, the sort of official ideology of capitalism says it's all about markets, but in reality, like markets, as Carl Polanyi pointed out, are based on nation states, right? So you use your power as a nation state to give all your players an advantage in the global system. So the South Korean government went and basically, promoted all its own industries and created these strategic protectionist things. And Ha-Joon wrote a book about this called Kicking Away the Ladder, which was about the American ideology, which was about America originally used protectionism to get up the ladder. And then it used places like, the IMF and World Bank to promote a different story, to say, okay, once we've up the ladder, we kick the ladder away, and then we tell everyone else to do free trade, right?
Yeah.
And that's been a big part of like the US story for a long time. And now it's interesting, it's like Trump's going back to some of that protectionist rhetoric, right? So he's like, oh, suddenly the international system doesn't work as well for us anymore. So we drop the pretense of the liberal international order and we go back to that, like throwing our weight around, using our like America first shit, right? So it's sort of, I don't think he's being influenced by Ha-Joon Chang. I think he's been influenced by people with very different like intellectual backgrounds. So because there's a lot of like contradictory stuff going down in that tariff thing, and so some reason he's just using it as a tool to bully, right? So, I don't know.
Yeah. Meanwhile, to get back to the crypto subject a little bit, obviously Trump launched Trump Coin right before the election, and apparently people are saying that that's just a avenue for unregulated bribery. So, for instance, I think his name is Jason Sun. There was a crypto billionaire who was going through a lot of like lawsuits over fraud and so on. I guess he bought $7.5 million worth of Trump coin, and then the week later they dropped the cases against him. It just seems so frigging blatant. Um, but I guess that's oligarchy or whatever, or that's kleptocracy, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I was writing a note about this around the. I actually got this friend of mine who's writing a book about scams, and he has this sort of underlying sense that people kind of like being scammed or enjoy being scammed at some level. There's some kind of thing, and he's also sometimes using the sort of
clearly they must,
like scamming people as part of, again, talking about the sort of native cosmologies of capitalism. It's kind of embedded into some of that story. It's like you're sort of supposed to scam people at some level, and there's something weird like about people almost getting euphoric about being scammed so obviously, right? Because and this is something that my friend Max writes about quite a lot, is that there's lots of these sort of like background vibes in capitalism which are not supposed to be obvious, right? Like, no, the sort of liberal establishment would never overtly come out and say, the object of capitalism is to scam people. Yeah. Whereas where Trump kind of does come out and say it in a sort of like very obvious way, and he has this kind of like sort of S&M vibe about him, which is like, I'm going to fuck you over hard, right? And you're going to enjoy it. Yeah. And it's kind of like, there's something about that in that sort of meme coin thing he's doing. It's like, this is obviously a type of scam, but you're going to love it, right? Because at least I'm kind of like upfront and honest about scamming you. And I think this is, and in a weird way, the sort of moral horror that then emerges from all the kind of, the sort of New York Times writer or someone who's like, oh, how could you possibly, can't you all see that this is a scam? But like, that's kind of the point, right? It's sort of supposed to be a scam in a sense.
That's the jouissance, as Lacan would say.
Yeah. And so, this is why the
the
crypto
surplus
industry is loving
enjoyment.
this in a way. Well, some
Yeah.
parts of the crypto industry are loving it. Other parts that want to be respectable, but like, ooh, maybe we should distance ourselves. But then they stand to be massively enriched by the deregulation and also the actual strategic manipulation of the price that the strategic reserve will do.
I guess I'm always wondering, like, or what I'm thinking about a lot lately is how, when we look back in history, things seem quite inevitable. It's like, okay, like there was the French Revolution, there was a power vacuum in France, Napoleon pops up and, recaptures the grandeur, the sort of, nobility, the sort of monarchy, and, does the sort of inevitable wars and so on. Weimar Germany, had fallen apart and inflation was, off the charts. And so something like Hitler was maybe more and more even slightly inevitable. They also had this kind of Aryan, like racial superiority in the background and so on. Yeah, I guess it's, but it's harder when it's your present moment to fully understand the inevitability of it all. I mean, it's like what, and I guess there are multiple factors, obviously. I mean, America, Sam, we can see the comments, but it's just hard to reply when we're chatting. Yeah, I mean, America didn't seem like it was in such, I mean, I guess it was in terrible shape in terms of like health insurance and, most people, I mean, I guess I was lucky in that I was living in, coastal city among coastal city elites, not like, you know, in the terrible straits that maybe most people in the country are in right now, who like the average American, lives paycheck to paycheck and doesn't have more than like $600 in the bank, and one health problem will like basically ruin them. So yeah, so I guess things were pretty terrible. But yeah, and I guess also kind of one theory that I've sort of been thinking about is like, it seems like these tech guys, were so vastly wealthy and had such incredible secure power in society, but maybe actually they felt, as you say, insecure or fragile, particularly when other countries and other companies are starting to innovate more than they are. So, so that was like Lena Khan, who was Biden's kind of a person working on antitrust and anti-monopoly. They wanted to break up the big tech companies, partially because they felt it was bad for innovation and for American companies to, have these monopolies. They would become kind of stagnant, like as Meta has, or Google or whatever. And I guess the tech, billionaires felt that they didn't want to allow that. So it's a little bit like what happened with the fossil fuel companies, right, in the 70s. Like they knew that climate change was going to be devastating, and they could have said, okay, we'll take a loss, we'll cut back our profits and we'll diversify, and we'll, for good of the world, we'll go for renewables and so on. But instead, they doubled down on fossil fuels, and instead of they built a huge disinformation network, and bought Fox News and all that stuff to just like, you know, yeah, continue the destructive policies, even though they knew it was short term and was going to lead to massive destruction, as we can already see in LA and North Carolina. So it's basically these guys are doing the same thing. They were at a crux point. They could have said, okay, we'll demonopolize, we'll allow more competition, and then because we can see also that China is really outcompeting the U.S. in a lot of ways, right? Like, you can't buy BYD cars in America, but apparently, China's electric car company BYD is like much more successful than Tesla, much cheaper. And so it's
Yeah.
kept out of the U.S. markets. There's protectionism there. Similarly, TikTok had outcompeted Facebook by a lot, and of course, more recently, DeepSeek had outcompeted ChatGPT for a fraction of the cost, and so on. So yeah, so maybe there was actually a sense of fragility, and this was kind
Yeah.
of their last shot to kind of like take it all, before they somehow lost their standing.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of things there, which is, on one hand, they sort of see regulatory challenges, right? Which is like they could, like it's been a long time since people believed that the internet was fundamentally positive, right? If you think back to the sort of post-financial crisis, there was all the kind of imagination of Google being a kind of utopian type of non-evil player in the corporate system. That perception's changed now. you don't really find people romanticizing big tech anymore, right? So, and actually, you're finding the opposite. There's just like a lot of critique of big tech. People basically are kind of like slightly disgusted by it because they also realize how kind of well, they're essentially like digital crack dealers, right? They like hack our minds, and so
Yeah.
there's a lot of sort of cultural pushback, including from actually I'd say from young people, right? Because the sort of marketing sides of the big tech companies always try to make out that they're the kind of champion of the youth or something, but in reality, it's like if you're growing up as a teenager. You have to use all this stuff, but you're also kind of less romantic about it. This is just the reality of my world. I have to use it. Whereas all these kind of like 40-something, tech execs are the ones that try to create this sort of story of how they're, liberating the youth, right? And so I think that's all those stories are breaking down, though. So they have this awareness that there's a coming crackdown. If I was putting like my more sort of meta structural kind of hat on, I'd say also, this is always hard to spot in a global economic system, but it's possible we're just like hitting limits, right? We're hitting
Oh,
limits.
for sure.
Right? And in those contexts, if you're hitting, the sort of like neoliberal types of stories about capitalism and stuff, is always about, it's all about innovation and everything, right? But the reality of a capitalist system is it's only innovative in certain contexts,
Yeah.
In many other contexts, the capitalist elites will literally just go to the state and just be like, give us patronage and bail us out, and they'll lean on the state for profitability, and that could be the thing that's happening right now. Right there, they're basically hitting against limits to profitability and growth, and so they just start to realize that they have to now align with the state. So I think at some structural level that's going to happen.
It's more than alignment. It's like taking over the state from within, really.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Basically, kind of becoming the state in a sense. But so it could be a big meta story about the sort of structural limits to growth in a capitalist system that's going on. But that's of course very hard to detect.
What do you mean?
I mean, because it's such a large system, it's very hard to see when it's hitting limits, right? Because and one of the general like features when a system is hitting limits, it starts to fragment, like in various ways. Because typically, when you have an open frontier and you have an economic system that's trying to expand, for example, let's take with like technological unemployment, for example, like if you're like out on if you have large amounts of open frontier, you can basically destroy people's jobs through automation, but they can get new jobs out in the new frontier somewhere else, right? So your system expands as you have that kind of automation. But if you've hit limits, you can't expand. So what actually happens is everything just starts to fragment into smaller pieces, right? So you notice that all the tech billionaires are talking about this kind of stuff now. Even Elon Musk is talking about UBI and stuff. And one of the reasons why is that he's sensing that there's no more frontier. So all the automation that the company's going to try to do will just destroy jobs. Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I don't think he's talking about UBI anymore. He was talking about it a few years ago, but I don't think now that he's taken over the government from the inside, it's something that's, Sam Altman did one test of it that was very successful, actually, but nobody seems to be at the moment talking about him. That's actually one of the kind of main ideas I have for what could be, kind of a successful organizing kind of model now for people in the US, is the recognition that artificial general intelligence is going to lead to such huge unemployment, could actually be something that unites knowledge workers and laborers and so on. And it's sort of, in a way, it's ironic and maybe actually not a bad thing that the layoffs are going to hit cognitive laborers first, with other types of workers pretty soon down the line, if you think about the building of humanoid robots and all of that stuff. What are your thoughts about AGI and the sort of mass unemployment that's coming, and what humanity can do, or human society can do to prepare for this? Big question.
I mean, I don't know. It's like Well, at some level, I mean, it's an interesting opportunity. I guess this is something that's always predicted in. I mean, historically, the way the narrative works, there's the so-called Luddite fallacy, right? Which is, as people get removed from jobs, they'll find some new job somewhere else. This is the typical story that goes on in a system. But yeah, as that process isn't going forever. At some point, you literally just hit like internal contradictions where your system just starts to collapse, right? And I guess that's the story about things like AGI. Is like, will you hit an internal limit in the system where it just starts to break itself, right? And this is something that Marxists for a long time will talk about. And if that starts to happen, one of the first things that starts to happen is you get like reactionary political movements. So I mean, one way to start to look at, I mean, the reason that I actually became very aware of the Trump thing long before many other people is I work on protecting physical cash, right? So lots of the people who were originally following me about that were often actually Trump supporters. I would get lots of messaging and emails from people who were basically on this political right. So I was very, very aware for the last 10 years of this growing number of people who basically at some level felt deeply alienated by automation, right? And they wouldn't necessarily define themselves as being politically right-wing, but they did feel deeply alienated, right? And this community of people has now become known as diagonalists often, right? They're the kind of, it's a lot of these people who like sort of feel they're being sort of in relative terms left behind by, or sort of losing their middle class status at some level.
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of that kind of angst that Steve Bannon and people were tapping into was partly this anti-big tech thing, which is basically an anti-automation story at some level,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, your sort of sense of dignity and your livelihood is being undermined by these big tech oligarchs. And you got to kind of fight back. And weirdly, physical cash is one of the things. So this is how I found myself often encountering a lot of the sort of community around that. I mean, I'm coming from a different sort of ideological perspective on protecting physical cash because, but that's definitely a big part of it. Of one element of the Trump base was a bunch of people who sort of were concerned about this idea that global capitalism, represented by financial and tech elites, doesn't give a shit about them, right? And this part of the story around protectionism and like telling the international order to get screwed and all this kind of stuff is like sort of semi-playing into that, right? Albeit it's a very like right-wing version of the story. You could also have a left-wing incarnation of it.
Yeah, that's also where there could be. I mean, we're already seeing these sort of Republican town hall meetings where people are extremely angry at the MAGA representatives. It could be that they're beginning to realize that they've just been like swindled on like a large scale.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, I guess
But
like
the interesting question. I mean, this big question for you is like, how they're going to square that kind of like the fact that he's now included these are basically like pro-automation tech elites into the cabinet, into the power structure is going to be a very hard thing, because the basic story being used right now will be something like, okay, we're in this global fight against China, right? So, and this goes down to that fractal libertarianism thing, right? He's like, at a personal level, you have to fight each other in markets, right? At a company level, you fight each other. At an international level, you have to fight each other, right? And and you have different roles at each scale. So as an individual, you're supposed to fight in the market, but as a citizen, you're supposed to support your team to fight the other teams internationally, right? So they create this idea of like an American team fighting Team China. The reality, of course, is that there isn't a unified team. Like the actual teams in the global order are like capitalists, like the middle class and like workers. And that's a bit of a crude thing, right? But at some level, the American capitalist elite, like Musk, do not at all represent the interests of the sort of working man, right?
Yeah, of course, they're
Musk has a lot
transnational.
more in common with the Chinese elites than he does with the working Americans, right? So in reality, that is going to start to become apparent at some point, where it's realized that actually Team America isn't a single team. And that's where that kind of nationalist message gets very politically difficult for Trump. But that hasn't, the contradictions of that haven't expressed themselves yet.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's I guess as a sort of apprentice futurist or amateur futurist, I try to plot ahead. I mean, I feel a lot of sadness and almost like grief right now because it feels like we're really taking a very dark path.
Yeah, no,
And you know, however, there is also the possibility for some kind of disruption or you know mm, alternative to emerge.
what are you
But
feeling? What are you feeling hopeful about?
mm, it's just it's an interesting question. Um, I mean, obviously, I mean, not that I condone, murder or violence or whatever, but the killing of the healthcare CEO by Mangione was fascinating in terms of the level of public celebration and support for that. So there's a sense of there being, kind of like a under the surface. Kind of massive desire for so sort of like a real legitimate alternative to this predatory
Yeah,
capitalist monstrosity. But in the U.S., since the 60s, they basically have made it impossible for there to be like a healthy left in the 60s. Like they, went after the Black Panthers and and other leftist leaders and either imprisoned them or did whatever they could to disgrace them or even killed them if they could.
yeah,
So there really hasn't been a left in the U.S. And calling the sort of neoliberal progressive Democrats left is obviously ridiculous. They can't even get it together to raise the minimum wage or whatever. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So there is, I think, a hunger and a yearning. Um, and on the other side, there's, they're pretty much saying they're ready for war. They're ready for violence, and that's very concerning. And it does sort of feel that people have gone very down this road of ideological capture, hypnotism,
yeah,
to the point where, I mean, look what happened with Nazi Germany. Like when that reaches a certain level, it only the fever only breaks, when the whole thing causes total destruction and there's nothing left.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
historically, some of the war vibe, you can interpret it as a sort of thing that emerges when those structural contradictions are already playing out, right? It's like when you have the underlying tension in your society and you have the underlying class struggle, one of those sort of ways that you create the illusion that there isn't a class struggle is to sort of look outwards into these imagined enemies elsewhere, right?
yeah,
So, I mean, this has always been a big element of global conflict. Of course, like going back to the Mangione thing, it's like I suppose the sort of moment being glimpsed by lots of the kind of true left wing, right, rather than the sort of liberal centrist community, is like, okay, could there be, because for a long time the true left wing has been marginalized from politics, right? It isn't really, in terms of like your sort of more radical critiques, and in a weird way, there's a space opening up there, and I think lots of people in that kind of more hard left have realized that it's like the
yeah,
narratives are becoming more viable. So, and realizing that large amounts of the sort of Trump base, which currently is being whipped towards these type of sort of nationalistic, jingoistic types of things, could be sort of steered in a different direction, whilst addressing the same underlying angst, right? And I think that, of course, is the sort of I've seen lots of people who are around talking about that right now.
Yeah, what's certainly not clear in the U.S. is what an effective type of strategy would be, because it just
no, of
feels like
course.
the old style of protest is just going to
Yeah,
feed into the sort of the thing at this point. Like they want that. Like they've already, the Project 25 has like plans for kind of getting the white supremacist militia as like their brown shirts, who will then turn up at these events and start violence, which they can then use as kind of the reason for deeper repression. So yeah, it's a very
I see Guy talk about the left wing. You're not talking about the left, Guy. You're talking about a very specific subsection of the left.
yeah, exactly. Well, so I mean, I am trying to invite people into like a little bit of a consortium, at least at this point, a brain trust of people who in the US. And so I see this guy Sam is writing. So Sam, you can, if you want, you can send me an email, daniel.pinchbeck@gmail.com, and I'll add you to this, send me a little bit about yourself, a bio, and I'll add you to a Signal group. We're going to have an initial call. And we really are thinking about this AGI job destruction thing as potentially a very unifying issue that could really get beyond the red and the blue kind of like factionalism, and bring together like knowledge workers and industrial workers and whoever else. I mean,
Actually, also worth if you want to see it, there's Grace Blakely. It's a friend of mine who does really good work on. She's got a new Substack dedicated to positive types of political action, and so she's going through. I'm trying to find what it's called. Anyway, go to Grace Blakely and you can see her new thing. But she looks at very specific, concrete actions been happening at a local scale with different political groups who are looking to build resistance against the far right in a meaningful way or find new economic alternatives. And Grace is coming from. She's not coming from the kind of sort of, let's call it identity politics left per se. She's coming from more of this kind of structural economic left. Right? So it's all about how do you make meaningful differences in the lives of people that actually gets people on side, rather than alienating them. So it's definitely worth checking out her work. I'd say
she's based in the UK.
Yeah, she is.
I mean, the UK is a very could be a very interesting scenario for change to happen, I would think, at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And what else are you focused on these days? What else are you before maybe we'll wrap up in a few minutes? Anything else you want to share? How you're thinking about things, or
Oh, I need a holiday, to be honest. That's what I'm thinking about right now. I'm thinking about going to South Africa in April. I'm tired. But yeah, I've been working on this a course called Intro to Econ Life, which is a series of videos where I'm basically getting people up to speed about how to think like an economic anthropologist. It's very inspired by David Graeber and people like that. And so that's pretty fun, although it's lots of work. And then I have like so many different articles I want to write. But, the problem right now is that I have, as I'm sure you experience this too, is that you have to fight on so many fronts at once.
Yeah.
And basically, I'm wanting to do a lot of stuff around understanding the phenomenon of billionaires, like how people become billionaires, so people to kind of understand how kleptocracy kind of works. I also want to do a lot more on the sort of automation and AI, but then also on the crypto, right? Because people need resources right now on how to understand the sort of stuff around crypto. So I'm working on those fronts all at once. Yeah. But,
cool, buddy.
Well,
let's fold this up for today. Let's do it again. I
think
it's great.
cool.
Just if it looks like they can bring in a third person. I saw Stephen Reed was on for a little bit. Be fun to get him on, or somebody else.
Very
as a
cool.
third, or Grace Blakely would be amazing. Also, I'd love to talk chat with her.
That'd be cool.
All right. Well, we'll get some rest. Maybe I'll see you in Berlin. It's possible I'll make it on this trip other time soon.
Cool.
Otherwise, sometime soon.
Well,
And
if you're here in April, you can use my house if you need
ah,
your house.
ooh, that's interesting. All right, I might actually take you up on that.
All right, sweet.
Yeah, yeah. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Well, thanks everyone. Cheers.
Yeah, ciao, ciao.